All right, so we're going to start Greece tonight, but we won't have time to go through all of Greek history because it's thousands of years of history. So we're just going to try to get through the very kind of basic beginnings of it, because there's several different eras of Greek history. So we're going to try to get through the ones that really aren't as famous as the others. But Greece starts out here, which is in the eastern Mediterranean. It is north of Egypt and west of, on this map, called Asia Minor, but on most maps we'll call it Anatolia. So the Persian Empire is way out here to the east. This is the eastern Mediterranean coastline, and Greece pops up in the series of islands between Italy and Anatolia, what is today Turkey. Greek civilization pops up very early, around 7000 BCE or so it's way back in history. And the first major civilization happens on this island called Crete, this big island out in the middle of the sea. So that's where you start getting the first big populations. And there are Greek specialists that only study the island and study its ruins and whatnot. The interesting thing about Greece compared to the other civilizations we'll talk about is they have like very few really good natural resources. Greece is full of mountains. It's a very mountainous place, and mountains are usually made out of rock, which means that the ground is very rocky, so they have very little really good farmland. The Greeks will always have trouble growing enough food to feed their people. So for almost their entire history, they have looked to areas outside of Greece to conquer better farmland to gain control of enough of a food supply for them to survive in Greece itself. So it's mostly a very mountainous kind of area, not much good farmland at all. Something like only 12% of all the land in Greece is real good for crop farming. There's no large river systems really in Greece. So there's not a great natural water supply like the other civilizations we've talked about. Mesopotamia with the Tigris and Euphrates, Egypt with the Nile River. And there's not even really many good forests to cut down trees and make houses and weapons and whatnot out of timber. So Greece has resource problems, and a lot of historians are very surprised that you would get such a powerful society, a powerful civilization built up around Greece, because it seemed to be one of these places where people can't even take care of themselves, much less conquer foreigners. But many historians estimate, or write and guess and theorize, that Greek power comes from a different kind of source. It becomes more social. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But again, the first civilization, the first major instance of it pops up on this island called Crete. And historians have called it the Minoan civilization because the government is basically a monarchy, and the most powerful king in this era on Crete is named King Minos. So a lot of documents bear his name or his insignia. So it's become known as Minoan civilization. Most historians and archaeologists believe that Minoan Crete, that civilization, was mostly focused on trade. They were not really interested in conquering foreign places. They don't seem to have built big armies or big navies. They mostly seem to have built ships for just traveling around these island systems and buying and selling goods from one place to another. So they seem focused on business, making money, building prosperity for themselves. And even the buildings on Crete itself, a lot of them seem to be kind of warehouse-type buildings. So they seem to have somehow access to a lot of goods that they need to store for the long term. And even the walls of these buildings are not very thick, which indicates to us that they're not worried about being attacked. Because if they're being attacked consistently, then they'll build real thick, tall walls to fight off attack. Does that make sense? So just from the ruins of the buildings, historians and archaeologists estimate that Crete was mostly focused on business. It was a business class, not a warrior class, and not really very afraid of invasion. And we also find a lot of writing from this era on the island and on some places around the periphery, other islands around Crete. There's two different major writing systems in two different languages. One has, the experts today, the scholars call it Linear A, and the other one is Linear B. There are large inventories of these written records, which are found most likely in the old kind of office spaces of big businesses, where they keep their written records about where they're buying certain goods, what they're buying, how much of it they're buying, how much money they're spending. It's their accounting records and their inventories of deliveries and whatnot. At least that's what we think they are, because scholars have today cracked Linear B. They've deciphered it, so they have a pretty good idea what those things say. But Linear A, even still today, is a mystery, and it's been run through computer systems and all kinds of things to try to figure out, try to crack the code, and it's still mysterious even today. So any scholar that figures it out will have a very nice, easy career after that, teaching what this stuff means. And they'll be a world-famous cryptologist, basically. If any of you are interested and get a PhD in, say, ancient Greek history and figure out that code, you have a guaranteed career. Many have tried, and they're still trying. But there are opportunities out there for you. But we tend to find these in many different places, but mostly centralized on Crete itself. And the very fact that they have so many written records indicates to us that they're a very prosperous society, and they're doing a lot of business all over the place, because if your business is small and you can just remember things in your own mind, then why write it down? Does it make sense? So these are probably big investor-type businesses. All right. And we know that for some reason or other, we don't know exactly why, Crete becomes depopulated. And we don't know what caused it. Some historians think that it could have been a giant natural disaster, like a giant hurricane or something, or a storm hit the place and just caused such damage that people left. It couldn't be rebuilt. Others think it might have been a plague. Even others think that it might have been an invasion from some other place. It just kind of pushed people out or wiped them out. But Minoan Crete just kind of disappears suddenly. And this is right around the time where you're getting a lot of these Europeans moving through the area. And one large group of Europeans settles at this place called Mycenea, which is in one of the largest Greek islands called Arcadia. This whole series of islands is called the Peloponnesus. And these are just different geographical terms. So Minoan Crete has fallen, and quickly after, several generations of people, quickly within the terms of all human history, thousands of years. But it takes a couple hundred years for the next wave of people coming through to settle around Mycenae. They seem to rebuild stability and have a prosperous society. So Mycenae seems to get kind of overpopulated, and people start moving out of Mycenae and establishing other cities around these islands. Does that make sense? All right. These different cities, as they grow and expand and found new cities, they don't trust each other. So there's a lot of disunity. It starts off as kind of one group of, say, immigrants from Eastern Europe. But over several generations, they expand and they start fighting each other over land, and especially probably farmland, because it's just not good farmland around. You have to fight for every morsel of food that you can get for you and your city or your family. So these cities develop strong kind of warrior cults. They go to war with each other pretty consistently, so they don't trust each other. The individual city governments seem to be pretty strong themselves. So most of the people living in this area define themselves according to what city they live in, rather than just calling themselves all Greek or all Aryan or anything like that. So these become city-states, individual governments. And other historians argue that the very fact that it's such a mountainous place, it's difficult to get from one city to another. It's difficult to travel. That helps the isolation of individual cities, which, if people don't move out of the city and go to another place, they build up a kind of strong patriotism for their city and a hatred of the neighboring cities, distrust. And then you throw in the fact that they almost never have enough land to farm. They're going to fight each other constantly over farmland and water routes and all other kinds of natural resources. Does that make sense? All right. There's still writing going on, though. Linear B is still around. And we find a lot of Linear B kind of light stone tablets at a city called Polis, which is very interesting because it's been hundreds of years since Crete has fallen by the wayside, but they're still using the writing style. So does that mean that some of these cities are founded by former Minoans that moved off the island of Crete and went to the mainland? Who knows? Some others theorize that maybe people from the mainland that were already writing Linear B actually invaded Crete and brought the writing system to Crete. But this is still being argued today. There's no consensus amongst historians or archaeologists or other specialists in ancient Greece. But the fact that you have a lot of this writing and a lot of these tablets indicate to us that some of these are big businesses. They have big construction projects going. They're building bridges or dams or something, which indicates to us that they are controlling a large labor supply, which means that there are people that are making plans for what to do, how to build this stuff, and then have their labor supply to implement the plans, to build the things. So there's a stratification system in society. There's a group in control, and then there's everybody else. And it also indicates some kind of work specialization. There's someone sitting in an office somewhere drawing up the blueprints, and they hand the blueprints off to a head construction group, and they have a lot of laborers, so there's different kinds of specialized labor going on. It's not one person doing every single step of the project. Does that make sense? So that tells us a lot about what becomes known as Mycenean era Greece, or Mycenean culture, Mycenean civilization. This one also goes into a collapse phase around the year 1200 BCE. So they're around for at least 700 years. And they seem to thrive until about the year 1200. And again, we don't exactly know what causes their collapse. And they don't just collapse in the city of Mycenae itself. There's a collapse that kind of cascades through all of the cities on the island system. And again, we don't know exactly what caused that. The best guess that historians have for this event is that Mycenae itself just got overpopulated. It was a prosperous place, so a lot of people moved there, which is normal throughout human history. When you have a lot of prosperity, that's where the jobs are. People tend to go to that place. And when they overpopulate a place, maybe there's not enough food to go around, or there's not enough fresh water. And poor people usually take the brunt of that problem. And if you get enough poor people around that are pissed off, they can start a revolution. Does that make sense? Or at least start enough riots to do such damage to the city that people don't want to live there anymore. So the people who can get out do get out. They go somewhere else. Does that make sense? But where do they go? Maybe they go to the next city over, like Corinth or Argos. And what happens to that city? They suddenly have a lot of refugees coming in. Same problem. Their population grows beyond the ability of the land to feed them. And maybe you get more riots that start all over again. So the problem seems to have started in Mycenae itself, but then kind of dominoed out as the problem spread from one city to another throughout the whole island system. Does that make sense? There are other historians who argue against it. Maybe it was caused by something else, but that seems to be the generally accepted idea amongst many historians today. But when Mycenean civilization goes into its collapse phase around 1200, people become so worried about just surviving that they stop learning to write, especially Linear B. And writing just kind of disappears for a while. Does that make sense? People don't want to spend their time learning to write and reading books. They spend their days out in the farm just trying to grow enough food to eat. And they don't have time to spare anymore. That's how desperate it becomes. And you might say, well, what about nighttime? You don't have to be out on the farm at night. This is such a chaotic situation that a lot of people stay in their homes and they don't want to communicate with other people because they're afraid of being attacked. So it's kind of like a Middle Ages for ancient Greece, where people are just running around killing each other for anything they can get. And when you're that worried about just living to see tomorrow, just surviving with your family, that takes up all your energy. So there's a lot of distrust, even amongst neighbors. And we generally call that the Dark Age. Not because like the sky was dark forever or anything like that, but historians don't really have a window into that civilization because we mostly look at what they write down, right? Does that make sense? Or the big buildings they build or something like that. But in this era, I mean, the cities are depopulated, there's no one around to build stuff. So there's no new architecture, there's no new books being written or anything like that. So the civilization it's like a black hole in their history. Does that make sense? We can't see into it as historians. The best we can do is like dig up their graves or something and hope to find something. But that's really about it. And this Dark Age lasts a long time. It's 400 years. So this is several generations of people who grow up in these chaotic circumstances and spend their whole lives in it. So this goes on a long, long time. This would be like, if that happened now in the early 2000s, this problem isn't solved until the year 2400. 400 years from now. That's a lot of time. Does it make sense? So this is a cataclysm for ancient Greece. The closest we have to any kind of written down stories or sayings or really anything or anything on an educated scholarly level for Greece at this point is when one guy named Homer starts writing down legends, folk tales basically. And because others aren't writing, they're not keeping accounts, they're not writing letters, they're not building big buildings, his stuff is the only kind of written social records of what people believe or what they want to believe in stories that are just told over and over again down through the generations. So his two most famous stories are called the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are kind of like these long epic poems. And historians analyze them in extreme detail to try to figure out, why were these stories written down? Why is this so popular amongst people living at that time where they think it'd be important enough to write down? Does that make sense? And scholars often do that to try to gain an understanding of people living in a certain place at a certain time. They look at their cultural artifacts. Like there's historians who study, books written in late 1800s England to try to figure out what book is the bestseller at the time? And what does that tell us about what people were worried about or what they thought about? Because the theory is that whenever you get a best-selling story, people like those stories because they find something in common with their own lives or their own hopes in that story. Does that make sense? They have like a personal connection to it somehow. And historians often go into these different stories and books, and today movies, and say, well, what does that tell us about the society of the time? What they were concerned about, what they dreamed of doing, what were their aspirations, what were their fears, or what did they think was funny? What did they think was entertaining? Does that make sense? And has anyone ever read this stuff in high school or anything? Iliad and Odyssey? What are these stories about?
Journeys. I know the Odyssey is about a journey. Him trying to get home.
Yeah, it's all about trying to get home, where there's some amount of safety and family and some kind of like history amongst people.
Yeah. Also, kind of reinforces those kind of stories. Helped reinforce the mythology as sort of, the gods. The only reason Odysseus couldn't get home initially is because he tempted.
And they screw with them.
Poseidon, and he. The gods don't like that, so it kind of encouraged reverence for the religion at the time.
Yeah, and also it shows us that if you're trying to encourage reverence, that might mean that people are scared of natural phenomenon.
Yeah.
That they may be living in such chaos that they're just desperately trying to find a reason for all this happening to them. So they're really pretty desperate stories. I mean, his journey goes on for years and years, and has all this crazy stuff happen to him. He has to keep meeting these challenges and whatnot. Does it sound familiar? I haven't read them in many years, but that could give you a window into people's kind of psychology of the time, right? And one of them, or a few pieces of the stories, are really centered in a city called Troy, right? The Trojan Wars. You've heard of this? Troy is kind of out on the outskirts of Greece, and that's a kind of interesting thing. It's kind of out there on the Anatolian mainland. But a lot of people for centuries and centuries thought that Troy was just a legend, that was just a story, that it was never an actual place. It was just part of the folklore, and that Homer eventually wrote down. But many historians tried to argue that it was a real place, but no one knew where it was. So some archaeologists had tried to find Troy and tried to dig up all kinds of different places in ancient Greece to try to find the remnants of Troy. Until one guy in the 1800s, German archaeologist named Schliemann, had a really innovative idea. He started his journey at the same place where the story starts, and just tried to go from one place to another according to the written story itself, and hoped along the way he would find Troy. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So he just tried to follow the legend. And he looked for investors, and a lot of people told him he's crazy. This is all mythical stuff. You're never going to find anything. And then he found the damn place in the late 1800s. CE, after zero. And he becomes one of the most famous archaeologists in recent history, in the past few hundred years, simply for following the story. And he had a long career afterward. He became famous amongst archaeologists, at least. So sometimes you don't even really have to be that creative. You just follow the myth, and you can build a career for yourself right out of that. And Troy has since been excavated several times, and they're even still digging down into Troy today to try to find more remnants of buildings and grave sites and whatnot. All right. Eventually, around the year 800, though, the cities start getting repopulated. People start going back to the original cities, and even new cities start to pop up. Governments become strong again. businesses start to grow. They start trading with other cities. There's more jobs, and people start moving back into the cities after 400 years. So it's more of an economic turn of events that ends the Dark Age, because once you get more trade, businesses grow to the point they have to start writing things down again, and literacy comes back. We get more written records around the year 800, and the Dark Age ends.
It's different writing than linear A would be.
I'd have to look it up. I can't remember. No, I'd have to look that up. That's a good question. But historians generally call this the Hellenic era. The Greeks did not call themselves Greeks. The Romans called them Greeks. The Greeks largely called themselves residents of whatever city they're in or have allegiance to. And Greece was called Helena, or the Hellenes. That's what the Greeks called it. But they never look at themselves as one unified people. It's all according to what city you're from. So historians would call this the Hellenic era. And the Greek population just starts to explode, and you get eventually hundreds of different Greek cities, all the way up to the islands in the sea, and even back to Crete, and onto the Anatolian Peninsula and its coastline, and even going further north up into the Black Sea area off of this map. The cities start growing so fast that a lot of the city leaders, and they're almost all kind of monarchies or authoritarians or warlords of some kind, a lot of the city governments decide that the populations are growing too fast, and they seem to get really worried that the same thing that took down the Mycenean civilization is going to happen again. Basically, if they get overpopulated, they might not have enough food, and you'll get riots or destabilization, and you'll get another Dark Age. So a lot of the city leaders came up with a fairly innovative idea. They started building colonies. They started colonizing, especially further west, along the Mediterranean coastline, and started building new Greek cities far away. And usually one city would kind of build one colony. Like the city of Sparta would build a colony at Syracuse, and that would be Sparta's colony. And another city in Greece, I don't know, Rhodes, would build a colony like way out here at Alalia or Neapolis or Corsica or something. So you'd have a one-to-one relationship between the home city and its one colony. Does that make sense? That seems to do two things, or several things. Number one, it gets all these extra people out of your city and send them somewhere else. Right? Does it make sense? Number two, you're colonizing a place, which means you're taking resources often from that place. And they usually look for good farmland type areas.
So the individual city-states were powerful enough to go to a new land and just do what they wanted pretty much individually?
Conquer the place. These usually are not empty places. There's people there already, and they just send in armies and conquer it. Take it. Same kind of imperial strategy as today. And they set up a colonial government run by the Greek city itself. So yeah, it's just like when Spain or Britain or whoever come out to the Americas and they kick the natives out and they build their own little colony, and it's run by their home government basically.
It doesn't seem like they would have that many people.
Their populations are exploding. They're one of the giant sources of prosperity at this point, especially in this whole region. So yeah. And it's not just Greeks that grow up in the place themselves. People move from Egypt or from other places to go to the centers of prosperity, right? Just like, say, New York or Los Angeles today. People come to these places from all over the world. This is where big jobs are. This is where people come to try to get rich, right? And there's some historians have actually written books. There's a really good one on, I think it's even called Imperial San Francisco, where San Francisco started off as a city just on the very edge of a peninsula, and today has basically taken over the whole Bay Area and gone even further than that. In the 1800s, when San Francisco started to grow, just basically colonized all the land around it, just started sucking resources out of it. right? Los Angeles is the same. 100 years ago, you couldn't live where we are now. And Los Angeles's population was like 30 or 40,000. Does anyone know what it is today?
Around 7 million.
LA, the city.
The San Fernando Valley area, basically,
yeah,
is like 5
if you include
million.
Orange County, you get to about 16 million, all the way out to where we are. I mean, it's a massive amount of people. It's not possible unless you take resources from others.
In California,
I mean,
all the water comes from
yeah, LA's big thing is water, because this is a desert without the massive water supply, and we take it from others. You ever seen the so-called California aqueducts? And if you look at an aqueduct map of the state of California, it's massive, and it's all coming south.
huge.
Yeah. Comes all the way down from like 200 miles away. It's huge. That's one of the scary things a lot of people don't talk about. A lot of people are scared of earthquakes, right? I'm more scared of what the earthquake does to the water supply, because all those aqueducts go right over the fault lines. Big enough earthquake hits and cuts that water supply. LA is out of water within a matter of hours.
Our whole area is supposed to have I think 3 months of water supply from like Crystal Lake, Lake Elsinore. Those are all supposed to be.
I would doubt 3 months personally, but we'll see what happens. It'll be fun to find out. That's why some of my friends they refuse to even go to Las Vegas. They have one water supply. Cut that line, you got millions of people. They're out in the middle of the desert with no water around. Does that make sense? No. Well, it doesn't really make sense, but you understand. Build a city out in the middle of the desert. Great idea. But yeah. We'll see. That's one reason that I hope to eventually go north and go to a water supply, but we'll see what happens. But yeah, resource shortage is a major problem in the ancient world and in many places still today. And the Greeks at this point in their history, they're taking extreme steps to guarantee their own survival. And steps that really brutalize the people that are already living in these places that they want to colonize. And the Greeks, really each individual Greek city believes that they are like the best humans that have ever lived, and they have the best culture and the best religious ideas and the best language and best music and on and on. So when they go to a place like as far out as modern day Spain, and they run into native peoples of that area, the Greeks are very arrogant, and they think, oh, these people are worthless. They're a bunch of dirty, stupid, uncultured people. And sometimes they massacre them. But they almost always look down on them. And the Greeks call them barbarians. Anyone know where they get that word barbarian from?
Their hair, right?
Not just their hair, but the way they talk. The Greeks look at all these other people talking, and they say, oh, they're just basically saying, ba, 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 like baby talk. So they call them barbarians. That's where the word comes from. It's basically calling someone almost kind of animalistic. You don't even know how to speak. And they treat them like animals. So there's a lot of racism amongst the Greeks. And there's a lot of enslavement and massacre to build these colonies, just like the Europeans do to the Americas.
Now, in terms of looks, were the Greeks Mediterranean looking, or were they white looking?
Well,
at that time.
That's a tough question to answer because, well, there's probably more recent research than I've looked into. I heard all this story in the early 2000s, so maybe there's more DNA research that's been done on some Greek grave sites all around the place that I just haven't kept up with. But one problem is that when you rely on someone's art to depict themselves for what they actually look like, sometimes they might not actually look that way, right? And when the Greeks start getting really prosperous and powerful in the Hellenic era, they start making paintings of themselves and statues of themselves and all kinds of stuff, and maybe not portraying themselves exactly as they looked, right? They might have an artistic ideal or just what they want to look like instead of what they actually look like, so they draw it up like that.
Filters.
Huh? Say again?
Snapshot filters.
Yeah.
Especially in sculpture, the Greeks are the ones who came up with the golden ratio for like the perfect human specimen. So it would be really impossible to know how they would look because they want to make every statue look like the perfect human being.
They're basically airbrushing themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. And statues are really expensive to build, so if you don't know how to carve a statue yourself, you hire a sculptor, an artist to do it for you, and you may pay him a little bit extra to make you look better, or to make your kids look better, right? Yeah. I had a friend who was taking family pictures of him and his kids and stuff, and used to go in there and airbrush, like in the spare time, get rid of all the blemishes and like making perfect pictures. Yep. Nice. People really love their family pictures. I don't have kids, so I ain't doing this stuff. I take pictures of me and my cat, I guess. I don't know. But yeah. So there's that. But do you want to rely on people's projection of themselves as an accurate thing to determine what they look like? Is kind of up in the air. But again, I haven't kept up with the research in a good 15 years by now.
Because you mentioned the word Aryan.
Yeah.
That's when they started
Well,
going into the Middle East. So
Aryan at this point is not like the Hitler Nazi Aryan. That term gets a very different meaning much later. Yeah, it gets twisted. The Germans come up with this reverence for really tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, muscular guys in like the 16 and 1700s. I think it's kind of weird, but that's just me. The Greeks also, throughout their history, especially in the Hellenic era, start developing this thing called the Polis, which becomes centrally important to their whole civilization, and especially in the Hellenic era. The Polis is a kind of meeting place, and the word is used in a lot of different ways. A polis can be a big room where people meet, so like a gathering place, like a big banquet hall or something, or a gymnasium, as we today call them. Or the polis could also be the meeting of people, so it can be applied to like the group of people or the place they meet. Does that make sense? It'll make more sense as we get into it, hopefully. The polis is the meeting, especially of men in the city. The polis is like an athletic club, like a boxing club. Or maybe today like a UFC club, I guess. This is where men get together, adult men get together, and they drink and they challenge each other to kind of physical combat to see who's the biggest and the strongest and the best. So this is a kind of social space for men only. Women are kept out of this. Where individual men kind of build their reputation in their society by boxing matches or weightlifting matches or running races or arguments or whatever they're doing. And sometimes they do different things on different days, different types of competitions. So men kind of define themselves in their society within the polis. And because these are meetings of the men, usually the ones that are the smartest or the strongest, they tend to also rise to be the kind of political leadership of the city. The ones who can defend their reputation in the gathering space, in these clubs, build such kind of fame and power amongst themselves that they eventually kind of transform themselves into the city's leadership. Does that make sense? All right, so polis becomes the root word of politics. That's how important, how fundamental the polis is for Hellenic civilization. So you get a lot of status within the polis. And in a lot of these competitions, it's, say, for argument or for writing the best song or making the best statue or the best painting. Sometimes these are not so much for your own individual personal glory within the polis. Some sculptors or musicians or bridge builders or whatever they're doing they do things, they build a great bridge to honor their city and show how their city is so much better than all their neighbors. Or they build a gigantic building or a giant statue or a mall or something.
Is it every middle class farmers, or is it just?
It's pretty much all the men. There isn't a big middle class, put it that way. There's, big landowning families that are rich. There are smaller landowning families that you might call middle class today. But there's not that many. There's a giant difference between the rich and the poor. And usually, almost all throughout human history, education is a game for the rich. So in order to go to school and learn how to read and write and maybe become an artist or a musician or whatever you want to be to honor the city, or be an architect to build a bridge or a building or something, you have to have that high level of education. So city leadership almost always kind of falls to the wealthy leaders, the wealthy families, the wealthiest families. But there's a chance that if you're from a middle class kind of background, that just through talent and hard work you can kind of rise up, right? And build your reputation on that. So there are some instances where a soldier in the army gets such a great reputation that he can rise up into the city's leadership and bring his family along with him in higher and higher reputation. So it's all about kind of family and personal honor. But once you gain a lot of personal honor, you might want to do things for your overall city to show that you're dedicated to proving how great your community is over all the other Greek cities. I mean, there's like 200 Greek cities out there eventually. So, number one, the Greeks think that they themselves are way better than any other civilization that's ever existed. But most of the Greeks don't define themselves as overall Greeks. They are members of their own city. So there's a lot of competition amongst the cities for limited resources. And if you, within your city, can build your reputation based on going out and conquering some good farmland for your city, then you could build up your personal honor to the point where they kind of launch your political career. Does it make sense? So much like today, many politicians aren't politicians at first. They start off in sports or movies or something, and they get famous off of that. That's where they build their name, and then they go into politics later on. So there's been baseball players and football players that became U.S. senators. And then there's that guy. Yeah. Started off with nothing and got famous for weightlifting and then in movies, and just kind of built up to there and became governor. So, yeah, these stories still replicate themselves. And there was one U.S. senator for years, I can't remember where exactly it was from, but he was one of the first American astronauts. He got famous off of that and then went into politics and became a long-term senator. So, yeah, they come from all over the place. But this intense competition within a city, within the polis, convinces some guys to try to figure out how the city can use its resources the best, how to come up with the best plan, right? Because if your plan is successful, you'll get famous and you can be one of the most powerful in the city. Therefore, each city is trying to figure out how to use their resources most efficiently. Does it make sense? And they're in competition with each other. So many historians point to this as how the Greeks build up their civilizational power. They don't have great resources, they don't have great rivers, they don't have great farmland, but they become obsessed with sucking every ounce of value out of just every single resource that they have. Because that's how they launch into fame and wealth and power. Is that clear? Questions about that at all? No? All right. It also impacts their way of fighting in their armies. Especially in the Hellenic era, well, before all this, the armies used to be just made up of a bunch of guys with weapons, and the general would say go, and everyone would just run at the enemy and get involved in just individual hand-to-hand combat with the enemy. So you'd have thousands and thousands of individual little skirmishes going on, and one side would win usually. The Greeks figure out a more efficient way of doing that, of getting their soldiers together and attacking in a directed, rehearsed way. So each city will build up soldiers that are given 3 different kinds of weapons. Number 1, let's see, I can't really see it on here, but each one will be given a short kind of sword, maybe about 2 or 3 feet long sword, fairly small, handheld type sword. A lot will be given spears, stick with pointed object on the end, but all of them are given a shield to defend themselves. And the shield becomes known as the Hoplos. That's what the thing's called. And this becomes known as hoplite warfare because the shield becomes by far the most important. So they eventually organize themselves together in a column, what they call a phalanx, which is usually about 8 or 10 guys deep. They all line up and they practice marching together. And the idea is that if all of your guys can walk in unison in a directed way and follow instant orders like change direction and move around or turn around or do whatever you're trying to do, then they can go up against a whole bunch of other soldiers that are untrained, and if you march in a unified way, you just basically go through them like a tank, right? You just run them over. Because if the enemy is disorganized, you just trample them. So the guys at the front would lower their spears and just start walking toward the enemy army and just run into them and take them out and just, destroy them. So the guys in the front would lower their spears and hit the enemy. The guys in the back, if they had spears, would raise them so you don't hit your ally in front of you in the back, right? And this was extremely effective against just infantry out there, unorganized infantry. To the point where other Greek cities started copying it. And eventually, when Greek cities get together to fight, they will each have a column. And they'll just start marching toward each other and just smack each other. And just crush each other. Does that make sense? So it's like the opposite of a tug of war is. The kid where you have a rope and you pull. And whoever pulls the hardest drags the enemy forward and you win. This is the exact opposite. You're pushing against each other, which is much more brutal. And that's why the shield is so important. The guys in the front would lower their spears and run at the enemy, but when they hit, all those spears were destroyed. The guys in the back would all hold their shields in a line, and you can see with the picture on the image before. Whoops. The guy's holding the shield on his arm, right? And he'd hold the shield, so the shield would only cover half of him, and would cover half of like this empty space, and the soldiers would get packed tightly together. So you had to rely on your friend next to you to keep holding his shield up. Does that make sense? Or else you die. So they all have to rely on each other pretty closely. And basically the two columns smack into each other, and they just push and push and push and push and push until one gives. Does that make sense? So this is like bone-crushing warfare. And usually the best organized group who can march in unison wins. Because if you have a few soldiers in your phalanx that aren't following orders, they become kind of weak links and they just kind of break down, right? And with that kind of intense pressure of smacking each other, really grinding into each other, wherever that weak link emerges, they just get trampled. And it just dissolves and you just run them over. Does that make sense? No? So this is extremely, hard physical contact. And the goal is to break down the enemy phalanx and run them over. So this completely relies on just brute physical force, muscle force, of all the men moving in unison. And it takes a lot of training to do that. If you're talking about, 10 deep and maybe 10 wide, that's 100 guys. They all have to march perfectly in step and follow orders in an instant. Because anyone who falls behind or falls out of sync with everyone else, that can be the weak link that destroys everybody. Is that clear?
Have you ever seen 300?
Yeah.
Is it like?
I've seen parts of 300 and
Didn't like it.
I didn't think it was very good, but I hear that they present this in a fairly accurate way. I haven't watched the whole
Sounds
thing.
like it.
Yeah. I don't know, I haven't watched it. I do like the beginning when they're talking about how the kid is raised, and we'll talk all about that in a few minutes. But again, the shield is the most important weapon because that's what most of these guys are fighting with. They're just pushing on the shields. So most of them don't even get to use their swords and spears. And it's extremely brutal type of fighting, and people are just crushed to death. And usually all the guys in the front, they're all going to die. They're not going to make it out of this alive. They're just going to get crushed. So it was a very brave thing a very honorable thing to volunteer to be in the front row, because that's pretty certain death. So it's generally called hoplite warfare because the Hoplos was the shield. Questions about that at all? That make sense? Let's see, what else we got here? This kind of warfare really relied on all the men in the army at any given time being physically ready to fight on a moment's notice. If your city goes to war, the soldiers have to get together and they have to be well trained and physically fit. And this kind of warfare relies on real muscle. So the men of the Polis have to be always ready to go to war. And wars in ancient Greece are constant among these cities. There's about 200 cities, give or take, at the height, and they're always fighting each other, almost constantly. There's never one single year where there's a general peace in what we today call ancient Greece. It's constant warfare.
What about the Olympics?
Well, they don't involve all cities. Some cities drop out of the Olympics because they want to keep fighting. Yeah. And what we today call the Olympics, they don't go on for the whole year. So warfare is just kind of an epidemic, normal way of life for the Greek cities. So the men have to be strong, really physically strong, and also well trained to march in unified ways, or else they're going to lose. And they know it. There's no mystery to them. And the city knows that the armies have to be, well trained and prepared and physically fit. So a lot of these cities build what we today call gymnasiums, public spaces, where you don't have to pay to get in, so that the soldiers could, lift weights and run races and do all that kind of stuff and train in marching to keep their city well defended. So a lot of these gymnasiums were built at city expense. Because they realize this is their kind of national defense, their city's defense against invasion. And they're called gymnasiums because a lot of these guys trained and sometimes even fought naked. And the Greek word for naked is gymnos. So that's where we get the modern term. And Greek civilization came to really revere and honor what they called the perfect male physical form, the really muscular guy, because this is like the most heroic, the strongest, the one that's defending the weak and everyone else in the city. So a lot of Greek art that you see in museums and whatnot portray the men as doing something physical in order to show the musculature moving and the human anatomy. And the artist studied human anatomy, the relations of muscles and tendons and all that stuff. as the guy on the left is throwing a discus, so you can see all the muscle working, through the legs and through the arms and whatnot, and all the strain in the muscles and tendons. And they studied the human body in order to make this art. The figure on the right is portraying a soldier who appears to be dying in battle. He's been trampled. His phalanx is lost. So he's laying on the ground with his shield.
Soldier's leg. It's like halfway off. His leg is off.
Yeah, the problem with a lot of these ancient statues and artworks and whatnot is sometimes they get lost or they get buried or something. Or they're on a ship that sinks and they get damaged. We've never found some pieces of them. Yeah. But there's many, there's thousands and thousands of statues that we found. And some are right here in LA museums.
Laocoon has a few. Laocoon has a few.
Yep. So questions about these? Nope. And they even portray their gods in this way. The god on the left is being punished for warning some political leaders that they're about to be invaded. And so this is kind of like the snakes of Hades, like dragging him down into his afterlife or God world punishment, basically. And he's struggling, so you can see the muscle as he tries to escape. And Jupiter, one of the major gods, or renamed Jupiter later by the Romans, is portrayed as extremely strong and built up, and the alpha male type. Yeah.
Provider.
All right, so you see a combination of the polis, this kind of competition amongst men within their own city, usually in some kind of like boxing or sporting or arguing or something, combines with military service. It's seen as extremely honorable to, when your city goes to war, to volunteer to be in the army, to be ready to fight. And the flip side is also true, that if you don't volunteer to fight, sometimes you're kind of socially ostracized, which means you're shunned in society if you're labeled a coward, you don't want to go out and fight and defend the city. Many cities cannot afford or simply don't want to provide weapons for their soldiers, especially shields. So a lot of men are told to make or buy shields for themselves and keep the weapons in their own homes in case war breaks out at any time. Which is interesting because the city is now kind of like outsourcing the costs of the military in a lot of ways. And makes a lot of individual men throughout the city kind of the decentralized military, sitting in their homes or going to the polis or going to the gym, and the city's defense relies on them to volunteer. And that's why there's such social pressure on them to volunteer if the city goes to war. Because if you don't get enough guys volunteering for the army, you're not going to win the war. The city might get conquered, and who knows what's going to happen from there. Especially in a city called Athens, which becomes a democracy eventually, the polis becomes a source of voting. So especially in decisions to go to war, it'll come down to a vote. And the men are given the right to vote whether or not to go to war, because they're often going to be the ones that go out and fight. And it's even today, especially in democracies, one of the reasons that you have voting age in the United States being set at 18 years old in the Constitution is that that's where the draft age starts. So the theory is, if you can be drafted and sent into the army to go fight, you should probably have a vote in who's running the government, right? Because you have a big stake in that decision. So it's probably a good idea for you to go out and vote. No?
Yes.
I think so. But some people disagree. And when the kind of military service idea merges with the polis, this internal competition for reputation, these cities become extremely kind of what we today call patriotic. They want to prove that their city is better than all the others, and sometimes they go to kind of extreme examples to do it, and sometimes going to war to prove it. A lot of these city leaders refuse to be insulted by other cities, and so they'll go to war just to defend their own personal reputations. So warfare amongst the Greek cities is epidemic. It's pretty much unending. There's very, very, very few instances where the Greeks all get together to do anything in any unified way. Largely because they don't look at themselves as Greeks. They look at themselves as Spartans or Myceneans or Corinthians or Thessalians or wherever else. Does that make sense?
Do they all speak the same language?
At least spoke dialects of similar languages, so they could understand each other. But some cities aren't even interested in talking to other cities. They think they're so great. I mean, why even talk to those other losers out there? And some cities even close themselves off to, or as much as they can, to visitors or immigrants from other cities. They just don't want other peoples. Other questions? Nope. Alrighty. Two cities will come to dominate the Hellenic era. The first of these is called Sparta, which is down here on this map it's called Laconia, but it's generally referred to as the Peloponnesus, this kind of southern part of this big island. The other one is called Athens, and that is on another piece of an island called Attica. So those are going to be two of the really big, important ones that we're going to talk more about when we talk about more of ancient Greece in future lectures. Well, you can see on this map, these are just two of hundreds of cities that are spread far and wide all over the Greek world. And that doesn't even include the colonies. Sparta rose based on conquest. They had a pretty good army, and they were conquering areas outside of Sparta, even other Greek areas, and enslaving their conquered peoples. So a lot of Sparta's economic rise to prosperity is built on enslaving people, slave labor. And the Spartans over time become very worried about this because eventually you start getting way more slaves in Spartan society than you have actual citizens, actual full-fledged Spartans. So the Spartans evolve a heavily militaristic society because they're worried that at some point there's going to be a slave uprising. Most historians believe that the Spartans evolved this militaristic system over many years, many generations. But the Spartans themselves eventually create a legend that there was like this one king named Lycurgus who had this idea and passed this law and kind of started the military draft system that we'll go through. The system was basically that all able-bodied men would serve in the army. And they wanted these soldiers to be super dedicated. So whenever a Spartan child, a male child, is born, the city leaders, kind of doctors, would inspect the body of the newborn baby for any imperfections, like short arms or a small head or anything like that. And any, especially male baby, that was seen as like physically weak or deformed or had any problems at all, they would let it die. They would kind of throw it out into a cavern and let it starve to death or freeze to death or whatever. So they were obsessed with having the strongest babies possible. And these Spartan children were raised with their parents for usually the first 4 or 5 years or so. And about age 5 or 6, the male child was taken away from the family and basically put into a little elementary school kind of to be raised with other children his age, and they start real military training at that young age. So they start learning kind of hand-to-hand combat as kids. They start playing with like sword-like kind of weapons. They start boxing matches with the kids, and they reward the children. And they don't go back home on a daily basis. They stay in these kind of like barracks schools, these military schools. And the children are promoted and rewarded according to their strength and power and ability to push others around and win the competitions. Does that make sense? And they stay in those schools until about age 17 or 18. So they're basically their whole lives from a very early memory are spent in these schools with the other children. So they're often more dedicated to the other boys that they grow up with, right, than they are to their own families. Does that make sense? And they're instilled with propaganda telling them that Sparta is the greatest city ever, and everyone else is just kind of crappy in comparison. So they become full-fledged soldiers as long as they pass a series of tests, starting about age 13 or so. They become full-fledged soldiers about age 17 or 18. They go into the Spartan army. And these soldiers are super dedicated. They fight to the death. The Spartan soldiers are said to never surrender. The saying was that you either return to Sparta victorious or you're brought home on top of your shield as a dead body. You don't ever surrender. Anyone who surrendered or ran away from the battlefield was totally ostracized from society and told that they're pretty much worthless. There's no point in living. So they continued serving in the army, and the Spartan army was therefore known to be the most brutal, the most unbeatable in all of Greece. Like, these were the super tough guys. These are like the Navy SEALs of Greece, right? There's no way they can ever be beaten, and they loved absolute hardship. The food they ate was called the black broth, which was like a bowl full of some kind of black soup that reportedly tasted and even smelled horribly. And these guys said, "Give me more, I love it," and they just keep eating it. So they're super tough guys, super macho guys. And these armies are so powerful that every other city in Greece fears Sparta. They don't want to have to fight these guys. They're nuts. Does that make sense? So Sparta, they constantly go to war because a lot of cities they go to war against don't even want to fight these guys. They give up without a battle. So Sparta is a hugely powerful city. If you're a Spartan soldier and you survive to age 30, that's when you're officially retired from the army. You get to leave the active army as long as you kind of fought honorably. And you are given a lot of land so you can start a farm and you get married and you start having children, and your male babies get drafted at age 5, and the process repeats generation after generation. In a military catastrophe, if the Spartan armies are somehow defeated or wiped out, even Spartan men over age 30, they're like reserve troops. They're like the National Guard. They get called up in emergency. But that usually doesn't have to happen because the Spartans almost always win. And Spartan society becomes very secretive. They do not want foreigners in their society. They don't want visitors really coming in their city. And any visitors that come to Sparta, they're followed around by government spies. The Spartans really do very little else other than train the best armies. The Spartans never really have good musicians or artists or philosophers or anything like that, like a lot of other Greek cities do. They don't have great diplomats. They don't build beautiful buildings. They don't build big bridges or anything like that. They have the army. That's their whole identity. So they especially don't want Spartan men intermarrying with foreign women. They're just absolutely paranoid of that. So they're very kind of closed society. They're obsessed with military strength. Does that make sense? All right. Another city is called Athens, and it rises from a very similar kind of slavery economic base. But their history goes very differently. There are slave uprisings in Athens. And there's not just slaves, but there's also a lot of poor people in Athens that come to resent the big landowning political families. So you get revolutions in Athens, uprisings of the average people to take down their own government that they view as corrupt or doesn't really care about the lives of average people. So politics in Athens is much more kind of chaotic for the long term, over hundreds of years, going into the 500s and 400s. So Athens will eventually, in one of its revolts, build a democracy. And it's the first known attempt at democracy as we think of it today. Democracy meaning the people have power through voting. So some of the best politicians in Greek history, or the best diplomats, tend to come from Athens because they have to get the mass majority of the population on their side in voting to win elections and become city leaders. And because this is a much more open society for debate, you need debate and democracy, so you need openness of ideas. So a lot of the best philosophers and writers and artists come from Athens also. It's just a more open society where you're allowed to come up with new ideas without being punished. You're allowed to criticize government without being punished. Does it make sense? There's a lot of different kind of forms of government that become associated with Athens. One is called oligarchy, and that means basically rule by the few rich, usually a few families, big landowning families. The oligarchs are just like this close-knit group, like a small political party, and they get onto the city council. They just basically run the place however they feel like. Does it make sense? That often leads to a tyranny where one very popular politician stands up in front of the crowd and says that these oligarchs are horrible, they're stealing money, they're making mistake after mistake. We have to all rise up and overthrow them. But who are you going to replace them with? And this one guy speaking says, put me in power and I'll fix the mess. Does it make sense? So tyranny literally means rule by one person who seizes power somehow through a coup against the oligarchy, or maybe through a mass popular uprising. Just people have had it, and they rise up and they're pissed off and maybe don't know what to do for the long term, so they want to trust this guy, whoever he is. Does that make sense? And one of the more famous of these is named Mycenea, and he's the one who comes up with the long-term idea for democracy, which means rule by the people, usually through voting. And we'll talk more next time about how Mycenea does this in a more detailed history of Athens in building a democracy. The thing to remember about Athens is it's really the one out of hundreds of Greek cities that builds a democracy. They're the one exception. Most of the rest of the cities are run by oligarchs or kings or someone else, emperors or whatever they call themselves, warlords of some kind.